Hi, welcome to our daily encounter. In First Chronicles chapter 13, we have the story of a time when the Ark of the Covenant was in transit. And the way that they were transporting the Ark was they put the Ark on a cart. And they had oxen pulling the cart. Well, there was a time when the oxen nearly upset the Ark, and so Uzzah reached out his hand to hold the ark steady. And the anger of the Lord burned against Uzzah, and Uzzah perished right there. David gets a bit upset, and he calls the place Perez Uzzah, which meant the breakthrough of Uzzah, and kind of in commemoration of this event. And I imagine David was a little perplexed at why God struck Uzzah down. And maybe we think about that too. It seems like Uzzah was just trying to help, trying to make sure the ark didn't fall over. But that is a good question. Why is it that Uzzah was put to death? Now, our first response to that would most likely be, well, he disobeyed the Lord. No one was supposed to touch the ark. He touched the ark, and therefore he died. And it might just be as simple as that. But we have to remember that there was a lot of things that happened in connection to the ark that wasn't necessarily lawful. We can remember some of the incidences back in 1 Samuel when the ark was traveling to different places. Even the Philistines had put the ark on a cart at one time being pulled by oxen. And a lot of things happened that were definitely not really spelt out as authorized in the old law, but no one in those instances were put to death, except for one instance where they actually looked into the ark where tens of thousands of people died. But we have to think a little bit deeper here. Why was Uzzah put to death? Because if it was just because he disobeyed, everyone that was around the ark should have died as well. Because the ark wasn't supposed to be placed on a cart. If you remember, the way that they were supposed to transport the ark was they were supposed to put the poles and insert them into these rings that were on the side of it, and they were supposed to carry the ark themselves. And so, if it was merely because of disobedience, you would think that not only Uzzah would have perished, but also Ahio, which was with him driving the cart. So, it might be something a little bit deeper than that. And I think it has a lot to do with what the Ark of the Covenant actually was. It was the very dwelling place of God. It's the place where God dwelt between the cherubim. And so what is happening here as Uzzah reaches out and touches the ark is he's touching the very thing that was in direct contact with the manifested presence of God. And therefore he died. This reminds us of Exodus chapter 19. If you remember there at Mount Sinai, the people were commanded not to touch the mountain. God's manifested presence was about to go upon the mountain, and they were not to touch it. If they touched it, they were going to die. And so it was not only meant death to touch God, but actually to touch something that God had touched. That's how holy God was and how unholy the people were. And so they didn't have the right to come up and contact God in such a direct way. Under the old covenant, to get anywhere close to God, you had to offer up all these sacrifices. You had to go through the priesthood to actually make any type of vows or anything like that. You had to. In other words, there was a system that you had to follow in order to have any type of relationship with God, and it was somewhat at a distance. And so to march up and just go directly into the presence of God meant death. Matter of fact, no one was able to go into the Holy of Holies, where the Ark of the Covenant resided, except for the high priest once a year on the Day of Atonement. That's just how holy God was and how unholy the people were. Now, as we go through human history, we're going to come to a point in human history where all of that changed. All of that changed. There was a point in history where God went from being inaccessible to being very accessible. And this happened with none other than Jesus Christ. In John chapter 1 and verse 14, it says, and the Word, and there John refers to Jesus as the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we saw his glory, glory as of the only begotten from the Father, full of grace and truth. Before this point, flesh and God didn't intermix. Again, the flesh of Uzzah touched the ark, and he was put to death, or God put him to death. But here with Jesus, you have God and flesh mingling together. You have humanity and divinity mingled. And so you can see a transition taking place to where now we're going to see from this point on, as we watch and read about Jesus' life, that now God mingled with humanity makes God very accessible. As you read the Gospels, you can see that very, very clearly. Jesus touching the lepers, those who were unclean that nobody would come and touch, Jesus touched them to heal them. Jesus touching the eyes of the blind to give them sight. You might remember the woman with the flow of blood who came and touched the fringe of his garment and was healed. There was a lot of touching. There was a lot of personal. There's a lot of personal things going on between Jesus and those that he dealt with and those that he healed and ministered to. And so Jesus was very, very accessible. He was there in among the crowds. And so there they had basically God there, the presence, the manifested presence of God, not so much in the Ark of the Covenant, but in who was symbolically the Ark of the Covenant, Jesus Christ, as he dwelt as God in the flesh. And so we see now a transition taking place, and with the death of Jesus Christ on the cross, we saw also the veil being torn in the Holy of Holies, which represented now that access to God had been opened up. And now we have direct access to God. And we can live in the presence of God, and we can have the presence of God living in us. That is a wonderful, wonderful truth. Let me say again, we get to live in the direct presence of God, and the direct presence of God gets to live in us. This is the same presence of God that people were put to death for because it was so holy and because they were so unholy. But through Jesus Christ, we have attained to holiness through his death. In Ephesians chapter 1, we see that God had this as his plan all along. In verse 4, where he says, just as he chose us in him, that is in Christ, before the foundation of the world, that we would be holy and blameless before him. So mankind could attain to holiness and to becoming without blemish through the death of Jesus Christ. As Paul would go on to say in verse 7 of Ephesians 1, in him we have redemption through his blood, the forgiveness of our trespasses, according to the riches of his grace. And so because we have been cleansed, we've been purified by the blood of Christ, we now have access to God. This is a wonderful, wonderful thing. And so today, whatever you're doing today, if you have to go to work, or if you have things to do around the house, or you're going to the grocery store, whatever you're doing, do it with a conscientious awareness of the presence of God with you. Because He is there. Whether you recognize it, whether you stop to think about it and soak it in, He's there. And so you might as well recognize it. And it might as well just sit in quiet with the Lord until you get that awareness of His presence. And then go out knowing that He is there with you. This is a wonderful, wonderful privilege that we get to enjoy today. Now, there's a lot of things waiting for us in heaven. But the presence of God is what we get to keep for today and what we get to enjoy today. So let's enjoy it to the utmost. Well, I thank you guys for listening in today. I hope you guys have a great day. I love you guys. God bless.